Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be among you today. My name is Nisreen Elsaim. I am the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Very, very long title. Sorry. Well, here today, first of all, I want to thank the World Bank and Connect for Climate for convening this session and for inviting me to moderate it. Finance, which is the topic of our session today, is normally a topic that young people should not talk about. And that's why breaking this ice and breaking this stigma is what we are actually aiming to do today by having a young person moderating a discussion between two big signs of the climate action and the climate finance. Well, today is the thematic day for two topics that finance actually needs the most, which is Young and Future Generation Day and the Science Day. We have a huge gap when it comes to financing research, and also yesterday we launched a study that says that only 0.7% of climate finance goes to youth-led organizations and youth-led projects. So let's kick this discussion today and see how can we get more financing, more sustainable way of resourcing for different generations and for different scientists. Today here with me I have well, first of all, Sir Nicholas, Lord actually, Nicholas Stern, who is the IG Patel professor in the London School of Economics, and Mr. Axel van Trotsenburg, the manager director of operation at the World Bank. I really hope I pronounced your surname right. Both of them are very much championing when it comes to climate movement and the climate justice and the climate pushing for financing. And of course, the World Bank is doing a huge shift when it comes to how to be more sustainable in their finance. And together, they will break down the big numbers into more manageable pieces to all of us and identify the sources of finance and the different prototypes to scale up, deep, and of course out. A lot of the critical of micro and macro financing to sensitize the kinds of scale needed for climate change and climate action. Well, first of all, I will start with you, Nick and Axel, to a question that is very broad, but it's very important to set the floor. What is going to take, and who wants to go first of you in this? Who's older?
I'm older.
This is the question where no one will answer.
Yeah. I'm delighted you asked that question because it suggests that the answer is not clear. But I want to talk about the overall numbers, but do it in a way that begins a discussion of how to go down into their composition and how it works, because that's critical. But we were asked by the two COP presidencies, COP26, COP27, Vera Songwe and myself, working with Amar Bhattacharya, who is the driving force behind all this, to look at what's involved in terms of finance for delivery on Paris. Well, we interpret Paris, of course, in the light of Glasgow as well. The answer to that question comes from the point of view of finance through the question, what investments do we have to make? Finance for what? Finance for the investments necessary to deliver on Paris. Paris, of course, was about mitigation and the well below 2 degrees and the 1.5, which became much more than 1.5 as we moved on. But it's also about adaptation and resilience. It's also about loss and damage. It's also about natural capital. So we said, what investments or what kinds of flows of expenditure are necessary to deliver outcomes which could be delivering on Paris? So that's the question. What investments? I'll have to go very fast, but roughly areas are energy transition, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, natural capital. Roughly speaking, 1.4 trillion into emerging markets and developing economies outside China, because China's sui generis. We did talk about China here just a couple of days ago, but China doesn't need climate finance. That's why we put China to one side, not because it was unimportant, it's supremely important, but it doesn't need climate finance. So into emerging markets, developing economies outside China, 1.4 trillion as a flow of investment in the year 2030. Now, of course, the path to 2030 is enormously important, and we do talk about 2025 and so on, but just to keep things simple and short, let's just talk about 2030. Energy transition, 1.4 trillion, and roughly 1 trillion for the three categories: adaptation, resilience, 1, loss and damage, 2, natural capital, 3, where we think, roughly speaking, it would be a third of that 1 trillion. So it is a lot of work involved in getting to those numbers, but that's roughly where it comes out. Then the question is finance. But it's finance for what? We've defined for what. So most investment in most countries is financed domestically. So we looked at, but of course it's very different for different sorts of countries. So we said, well, roughly speaking, we would expect a bit over half to be domestic of the finance, and a bit, roughly 1 trillion as the external flow. So 2.4 trillion, maybe 1.4 trillion financed domestically, 1 trillion externally. All of these things you're going to find out as we get along. You know, there are no decimal or 2 decimal points here for these estimates. It's orders of magnitude. But we think those orders of magnitude are fairly robust. And then, well, very different finance, those different forms of investment. The private sector will be the majority, but it won't go there, and we're going to talk about that, without the right kind of circumstances in terms of policy, investing environment, and the right kind of structures on the finance side for reducing and sharing risk. The MDBs and the DFI, the multilateral development banks and the development finance institutions, will be crucial to working with the private sector to reduce risk, both on the investment climate side and on the financial supply of capital side. And they have to be there in very substantial numbers. And then the last category is, for many of these things, you need very low cost or grant money. And we identify 4 sources of money that doesn't have much in the way of debt service, or should not have much in the way of debt service. 1 is bilateral support, 2 is SDRs, 3 is the voluntary carbon markets, and 4 is the philanthropies. And so we argue that for all this to work, then you're going to have to triple the financial flows from the multilateral development banks in the next 5 years. It's just, you know, what are you going to need to help finance the investments working with the private sector? And we argue very substantial increases in these last 4 categories of low-cost monies, including a doubling from 2019 to 2025 of bilateral support, from about 30 billion a year to about 60 billion a year. Now, you know, the finance ministers of the rich worlds are pleading poverty, but this sum is trivial, and there's a deep, deep obligation to provide it.
I think we have to come back to that later. The commitments of the G20 governments and the G7, and how much lacking and the gapping of the finance that we are having right now is very important. But let's go first to Axel. Finance.
Well, I would say, look, Nick has just summarized it. I tend to be a numbers person, but you beat me this morning, Penza. I think what is very important is actually when we have a dialogue with youth. I don't want that this data is actually distracting from the need to mobilize the voice of young people. it is very important that we need there the passion, the commitment, and also the voice and the demands that something happens. And I think if something is more important than actually finance, it is that voice. Because only with demands that we act, something will happen. I think we can find the financing with the necessary political will. And that political will has to be generated by a very loud voice of the youth. Because in the end, it's their future. And I think that is where we need to push harder and harder on this. Now, I will still refer to some data, and I will not start to confuse Nick's data. But Nick said a couple of things. He mentioned the 1.4 trillion that is necessary for financing, what he said, if you exclude China. Now, let's keep that in mind. And if you say, well, a lot of countries need that support. So what does that mean for people from the OECD countries, from the rich countries? And there are about 1 billion people living there. So if you look what that means, and Nick said anyhow already a good chunk is coming from internal effort, say half, if that were to, then what it requires is $700 per capita. Now, please keep in mind that people in the OECD countries have per capita incomes in the order, probably on average, of $45,000, $50,000. Keep that in mind, these $700. And I think that is actually, it brings it more doable, because when people thinking about $700, that is something over a year. So you are talking essentially $60 per person per month. And nobody can tell me that we cannot do that. And I'm talking about the industrialized countries. And what is at the other side is a huge cost. We have been undertaking this climate and development report, and particularly in the low-income countries, because these big numbers is also distracting from the fact that the cost in the low-income countries are very, very high. And that means, in terms of GDP, anywhere between 8 and 12% of GDP of the country. So we need to keep that in mind. Those investments need to be satisfied. We also see that if we don't make these necessary investments, you're going to see increased levels of poverty and increased also misery, in particular in the low-income countries. So I would like to say, yes, we are throwing out a lot of big numbers of trillions, but if you bring it down to it, it can be brought down to manageable levels where ultimately it's a question, are you willing to do so? And to make that happen, here you need the voice of the youth.
So you're basically saying that we can actually do it together. This is a very inspiring message, that we are here together so we can do it together. And thank you, Axel, also for mentioning the new country climate and development report. Normally in climate change, there's a lot of acronyms. And when I was searching about it, I only found CCDRs. I was like, what is this? A new acronym also, oh God. We have enough SBI, Substa, etc., etc. And then I had a look at the report, and as a person who's young, but I spent 10 years in the field of climate change by now, I was surprised by a lot of things. So I can assume that as someone who, both of you have more than 30 years experience in the field of development, what do you think of the report and what surprised you the most? Maybe we can start again with Nicholas.
It is working. Yeah, I'm impartial because I didn't write the CCDRs, although it was close to a lot of people who did write the CCRs. And as I said earlier on the China CDR, I think it's the World Bank at its best. And really taking a sense of purpose and defining the sense of purpose. And that is, the drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century. But how do we make it happen? And so they're trying to answer that question country by country through the CCDRs. And, you know, they're granular. It's not just the drive to net zero, it's Paris more generally, because there's a lot of adaptation and resilience and natural capital in these stories as well. And I think one of the measures of success is how well those reports are embraced by the countries involved. I have to say, as somebody who worked for the World Bank for a while and has been close to it for a long time, World Bank reports are not always universally welcomed enthusiastically by countries. But it's very significant that these have been, because it really does help chart the way forward. And we were with, you know, we had the CCDR on China a couple of days ago, and it really is something where, you know, in that particular case, China welcomed it really very warmly as a contribution to its own analysis. And I think in China's 15th five-year plan, this is for the second half of this decade, which is going into the cooker really now, it will be influenced by that. And I hope that China will declare that their next big growth story is the drive to net zero. And this is not growth for its own sake. Growth does matter, but this is a new form, one that breaks the relationship between output activity on the one hand and destruction of the environment on the other. You ain't going to get to net zero by having zero output or zero population. That's not a good route. But you can get to net zero by breaking that relationship. And the young people demand it of us. But it's more than that. You know, I'm very privileged to be a university teacher, so I live with young people, and the beauty of it is you get older, but they stay the same age. So you see different cohorts going through. And the cohort that's coming through, and London School of Economics is very international, so we get a picture of young people in the world, not just young people in the UK. It's not simply now that they demand action. They're way beyond that. They're right into the details of what you have to do and the strategies to make things happen. And that's what, you know, you're not hopeful all day, every day, but you try to be. And they really do give hope. But as Axel said, they're well informed, they know what they're saying, they know what we have to do. Translating that into political pressure is very important. But it's much more than political pressure. I mean, I'd put that number one. You know, but it's where your savings go. It's where you work. It's how you look after your homes, heating or cooling. Is what you eat. You know, there's so much, and what you don't waste. And there's so much that young people can do and lead by example. So it's the micro and the big political macro, and increasingly that is exactly what you're doing, and please keep it up.
Thank you very much. Axel, what do you have commenting on the takeaways, and what surprised you after all of this time?
Well, I think actually what I thought was good, starting with COP27 in Glasgow, where I think for the very first time really seriously the whole finance questions were put on the table, and then the challenge to take this forward. And then of course a much more prominent discussion about net zero. And so for an international organization like the World Bank, it's nice to talk about it, but you need then to say how and what you should do. And I think what is important also in the climate debate, analytics matter, and then process matters in bringing all the different information. There I think the bank is good at that, because we are working on the ground. And I thought that what I liked with this whole studies project to link climate and development together, it has created an incredible wave of enthusiasm within the bank. We had a couple of workshops that made you feel good about this, basically, because we had a very good discussion about this. And it doesn't mean that you solve everything, but if everybody is engaged, you feel that. And that is actually very encouraging. But it is, in my mind, really a first step is to bring this. And I certainly don't hope that everybody's in agreement with it, because these are difficult issues. There are different opinions, and that is good, and that we can learn from each other. But what ultimately it needs to do is we need to create partnerships to discuss actively the way to net zero. And that is what you have then to do. Whether these are governments, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the international public sector, whether it is youth groups or others who want to participate, and see how you can help shape that. Because what also these reports are showing are trade-offs. Do you want the business as usual approach, which we have been modeling, or do you want the accelerated pathway? Well, personally, I'm more for the ambitious one. I will be very open to that. But if that is the case, what would it take? And so what we hope is really that as a next step is how do you translate this ultimately into also finance and investment plans, short-term, medium and longer term, and so. And I think that is going to be the important thing. I see this, then we will be able to improve on this. And I think that the interesting thing is that we should be very careful to not identify that every country has the same problem. The poorest countries have completely different problems than maybe China or others. And that differentiation we need. And ultimately, it may be also a powerful generator of discussion and ultimately of new partnerships, be it with governments, be it with the private sector. And that is what we need.
That's indeed the ambition and the different plans, long-term, short-term, and ultimately the policies that can actually lead us to this transition and take us in the right direction of ambition. Well, since you started with the plans, the short run, the long run, and the policies, Axel, we have talked about a lot of the adequate policies that can actually enable us to unlock the finance and take it to the right people who need it, as you mentioned, which is the poorest country who's the most impacted by climate change. But what can you be more specific on that, what that means, and how can we make it quicker? Because now we are not only in a fight with the financing launching itself, but with time, because we actually have no time and we are running very late when it comes to climate action. Can you be more specific and tell us, and also how quicker can we be in advancing, developing economies to be able to access this finance?
Well, that's a good question. For example, let's take the energy sector. So when a country has options, you could say, well, I'm going the easy route. I get a couple of more diesel generators and get my electricity from there. I think the more important question is, what are the actually policies that we can put in place that are aggressively stimulate the development of renewables? So that means that you need to give an incentive framework, is it? But if you have an incentive framework that is skewed towards coal or towards diesel, then indeed, actually, even with your best intentions, renewables will not take place. So that's a good example of it. Now, what can you accelerate? Quite frankly, again, in the energy sector, particularly in those countries that are relying a lot on coal, can you actually help them in the coal exit? And that means that we need to be very sensitive to it, because there are communities dependent on this. So we just had a project presented in South Africa that helps to decommission a coal-fired plant, the so-called Komati coal-fired plant. But then at the same time, you need to replace that with renewables. So you need to put that in place. And then you need to look at the communities affected, because you also don't want that these communities all out of feel themselves completely uncovered, lost their jobs, etc. So I think the social part is extremely important. Now again, the good news is it can be done. And I think it should be done, and it should not be done as a prototype, but it should be done as an ambition. So what we believe is we should, in the coal exit, have the most aggressive plan worldwide. In Asia, it will require in the next 20 years to retire every single day a coal-fired plant. Currently, that's not happening, and that's a problem. So we have to put a focus on it. I think we need to put pressure on this, and then with the necessary pressure, I'm sure the financing will follow.
Thank you very much for bringing the subject. I mean, I am from Sudan, and in Sudan, only 30% of the population have access to electricity. And I know that the government have no capacity to actually access financing. We have already a debt of 64 billion, I think. And the only answer for that is to have policies that actually enable not only the public sector, but also the private sector to access it. And we have projects for renewable energy access to people who doesn't have access to that. And Nicholas, earlier you mentioned the PPP, which is the private-public partnership. And now here we are in the same place where we want to launch the climate finance faster and more adequate. And of course, the private sector is a very strong and important player. So what do you think the largest corporations, international firms can actually help in reaching this climate finance, especially after the commitments that they actually made in several times? And what are we missing, and how can they help more?
Thank you. Can I just say one word about the term ambition? If by ambition we mean a recognition that the levels of investment we need to deliver on Paris and to avoid climate disaster, I'm okay with the term ambition. It's recognizing that what is necessary is a big number, yeah? But if ambition sounds like, you know, stretch targets, doing more than we need, it worries me, because this is about not falling off a cliff, right?
So you think the $1.2 trillion is a far target?
Sorry?
You think the $1.3 trillion is a far target?
The targets we described in our report of 1 trillion external flows contributing to 2.4 trillion of investment, I don't regard as ambitious. I regard it as what is necessary to deliver on the Paris Agreement, which was made for very sound reasons of avoiding unmanageable climate change and managing the unavoidable climate change, which is the adaptation and resilience. On the public-private partnerships, they come in different ways. And, you know, if you take India, for example, renewables is going pretty well in India, but there's a big problem. And, you know, associated with how the companies which distribute the electricity actually work. You know, when elections come round, they start to give it away for free. There's worries about how the grid structure works, and can you get access to the grid for your renewables? So one aspect of the public-private partnership, in that example, which is a very important one because renewables are fundamentally, we need a massive scale-up in renewables. One part of it is creating the conditions, in this case, the grid structure and the functioning of the distribution companies, which can mean that private investors can get a revenue flow which will finance their own investment. That's one example. There are many others. I mean, I'm very influenced by the first piece of applied work I ever did, which was in 1969, and I'm guessing I might have been about your age. It was tea in Kenya. And tea in Kenya was just after independence, land distribution, and the idea was to grow tea on very small plots and then collect it and take it to the factory. So it was private sector. Those were almost entirely women on their small plots, maybe a third of an acre, growing tea. And it went into eventually the tea factory, which is rather specialized thing, because you can't make quality tea in a tea factory, but you can destroy the quality of tea in a tea factory. So private at the beginning, private at the end, and lots of bits in the middle that were public. So these are examples of public-private partnerships in terms of activities. You also have public-private partnerships in terms of the money. And, you know, we've been talking about a lot of these activities needing very low cost or grant finance, and I described possible sources. So how you blend a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that would be public money. How do you blend that with the private money to bring down the cost of capital? How do you use your financial instruments like guarantees to help reduce the risk in the private sector? Now, the World Bank, you know, can do equity through IFC, it can do guarantees through MIGA, and it does, of course, do those things. And those are examples of the way in which you can combine public money, in this case MDB, money to help bring down the cost of capital. And, you know, Africa can build a system which is largely renewables, and it will be cheaper than the dirty alternatives. Yeah? But it needs a manageable cost of capital, 6-7%. And if cost of capital is 15-20%, they're not profitable. And they have a big social profit, but they're not financially profitable, which is what you need for the private sector to get involved. So that cost of capital and the different ways we were describing through public-private partnerships, not only that way, but in part, is, I think, very important. So I've tried to give the various different examples through which public-private partnerships can occur. But what we need here is the people who, often you find people in one corner of the room from the MDBs, in another corner of the room from the government, another corner of the room from private sector, and sometimes, not with people like Axel, of course, but sometimes you hear the people say, if only those people in the other two corners of the room got their act together, everything would work very well. And sometimes I can see the point. But the challenge is to get those people into the center of the room and work together, yeah? And work together as a team. And that, I think we're moving in that direction, particularly since Glasgow, to some extent before Glasgow. But we need to accelerate that kind of collaboration if we're going to get the levels of investment and their finance that we need.
Thank you very much. I'm learning a lot. I'm a physicist. I have no idea about financing in general, but I've been invited to speak a lot in panels that talks about finance. And I have Vlad, who's my colleague in the Youth Advisory Group. He's the economist of the group. He's like, Vlad, can you give me a small lesson? So I feel like I'm in a lecture now, learning a lot of new things. But you mentioned something very important, which is the role that the World Bank can actually play. And you took the ball back to Axel's field. So are we going to score a goal here? What do you think is missing in the public-private sector partnership, and how can we actually emphasize that, and what is missing, and how can the World Bank help?
I think that Nick said there are many things that we can do, we have been doing. The question here is not so much that we haven't tried a lot of things. What we need to do is the things at scale. Because I think what has been shown by some of these numbers, the challenge is enormous. So it's not like, can we not have one structure or another? I think you can find any structure and can be done. So I don't think I'm worried about that. I'm more worried about, are we all living up to the level of ambition that this challenge requires? And there the answer is no. And that is, I think that should be the concern. The concern is that if we hear day in, day out, this will cost this, but it is not happening. Or as I just said, We would need to retire every single day a coal-fired plant. It's not happening. In fact, there are plans to build hundreds of new ones. So that's a problem. And so we need to work on that. And that is regardless where you are sitting. I think whether you are sitting in a multilateral organization, you have to ask, can we actually do more? My answer for the World Bank Group is yes, absolutely. Can some governments do more? I think so too. Can the youth do more? Yes. What is the biggest common enemy? Indifference. Indifference that basically somehow this problem will disappear. And I think what Nick was trying to say is it's not going to do it because we are at the edge. And so you will disappear or if you don't. So, I mean, quite frankly, it is that part where one can do a lot more. And I think that is where I think the discussion should go towards that can we actually all add more and then hold each other accountable.
Thank you for mentioning this. I mean, in Glasgow, and this year there's a huge discussion about loss and damage and how can we find a mechanism to finance loss and damage. And I always tell them that if we actually financed enough adaptation, we might not need to finance loss and damage in the first place. And a lot of African countries, especially where I am coming from, for example, are suffering a lot from a problem that they did not actually cause. So what do you think, Sir Nicholas here, Lord Nicholas? It's so confusing, the British
Nick is shorter and better.
Nicky.
Nick.
Nick.
Only my mother called me Nicky.
Oh. So Nick. Adaptation. What do you think we actually need and how can we emphasize and enhance the financing for adaptation, especially from the perspective that you highlighted before, which is the investment in the public-private partnerships, and how can we save the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the one that actually did not cause this problem in the first place from being behind?
Yeah. What you said about loss and damage being a smaller problem if you are building well, resilience must be right, but it doesn't take the problem away. I mean, there are still hurricanes and so on. But what I wanted to say about adaptation, it doesn't cover the whole story, but it covers a lot of the story, and it's very important. And that is that adaptation, mitigation, and development, those three things which we all are worried about and we know we can put together, so often come very interwoven. If you think of mangroves, I think of mangoes as well, but if you think of mangroves, you know, that's storm, you know, that's protection against storm surges. It's actually very good at capturing carbon, and it helps the fish and the shrimps, yeah, and actually it helps the tigers too. And you know, somebody who worked a lot in India, I take tigers very seriously, and tigers help tourism. You know, there's so much. That's mangroves. I can't go in too much, but I hope it's obvious that public transport is adaptation, mitigation, and development. Decentralized solar, adaptation, mitigation, development. I've worked for nearly 50 years in one Indian village, and the grid is very unreliable. It's particularly unreliable through corrupt practices of turning people off. And India is not the only country in which that happens. So decentralized solar is actually making you more resilient in an important sense. And of course, it reduces emissions, and in many cases it empowers small and medium enterprises, often run by women. So I could go on, but you know, I've given the mangroves, the public transport, the decentralized solar, You could go on, restoring degraded land, mitigation, adaptation, development. Now, there are two reasons for putting it this way. The first one is the design of good development. You have to think it through in that way. But the second one is that it gives you a way of bringing in private sector finance, which might not be possible if it was only adaptation. Now, this is a very big part of the story. I don't want to pretend it's all of the story, it's not. But one way forward to get private money in was to really exploit those opportunities where those three things come together.
I totally agree, but a lot of also calls are calling to have a 50-50 financing for adaptation and mitigation, as most, I think 73% of the financing was now going to mitigation. Of course, I always say that we can only adapt to a certain point if the mitigation was not taken seriously. But how can we actually leverage to be an equal position where adaptation and mitigation gets the same attention, the same financing, while we reduce the emissions, but at the same time build the resilience of the community? Axel.
Well, in the case of the bank, we are actually there at the 50-50% level, and in Africa we are higher. I think that is also where it should be. I think what we need to do for organizations working in this business is that we are more deliberate on this, and not by chance that you say, well, this is, I think particularly when we are working in the low-income countries, it is very important. And I think, quite frankly, this can be done. It should be done. It could be done much quicker. I see many organizations still struggling. I think it is to put your mind on this. This is, to be honest, a management problem. I mean, this has nothing to do with some magic. I think if you're as an organization, the objective is to have this 50-50. But behind this 50-50 is a much more. It is a more fundamental development also issue on, and in particular when you are dealing with the low-income countries, that should absolutely be on top of your agenda. And I think this can be managed.
Could I move one amendment? I'm slightly allergic to 50-50 for the reason I just described. If we say, as we should, I think, that at least 50% of our activities should have a very strong adaptation contribution. Because if we say 50-50, it says, well, there's mitigation over here and there's adaptation over here. And I tried to give examples. All of the examples I gave are big, right? Examples where they come together, mitigation, adaptation, development. So I tried to say at least 50% of the work and the programs, the investments, should have a very strong adaptation element.
Yes, of course they come together, and Axel just mentioned something here very right. Sometimes it's adaptation need more, and this is a reality, and sometimes mitigation need more. It depends on the geographic focus, and it depends on the activities of the countries itself. It's been a great pleasure to be with you today in this panel, and I'm learning a lot, and I'm sure also the audience are learning a lot. But do you have final thoughts, takeaways that we can take home with us and dig more and maybe recruit some young people to be more finance focused to maybe help them advancing the situation and unlocking more climate finance for solving the problem?
So it's not about the financing. I think what you need is a lot of passion. I think whatever you do, also at the bank, I think you don't work with the numbers in mind, you work with the passion in mind, and you talk about the objective, what you want to reach. And I think one needs the voice, one needs to have them loud and clear, and that is ultimately what is necessary. I don't believe that you need to put that in numbers, finance numbers, because at the end of the day, it is of what do we want to accomplish together. And I think here we have a much bigger agenda for it, and we need a lot of and my last warning is that indeed I think that there's too much indifference on this topic, and that's a huge danger, and I think the youth can help in that regard.
Definitely. Nick.
I'm very much on the same page as Axel. I think it's an IMF figure that for the rich countries in COVID response, they spent around 9 trillion. So 9 trillion divided by 1 billion is $9,000 per capita. You know, the kind of sums we're talking about are much, much less than that. COVID was a big crisis, but this one is so much bigger than that. So what we have to do, and it's here the young people have to insist, is that to recognize, as Axel was saying, we're moving far too slowly. We have to, acceleration isn't even the right word. You know, we have to multiply by several times what we are doing. And we have to do that very quickly. And young people can say, look, we understand the problem. We've been studying it actually for longer than you old politicians. And this is what we have to do. And it's not nice to have, you know, okay, we'll move in that direction and we get there in 20 years or 50 years. As long as we're moving in the right direction, it's okay. But it's not okay. It is something that we really have to scale up very quickly. And young people understand that, and they can insist.
So passion, youth, public-private partnerships, unlocking the possible and a little bit of the impossible. I think this is our main takeaways from today's session. And again, thank you very much both, and thank you for the audience here and also online. It's been extremely informative, and thank you all for being here.